the one-year anniversary of the Parkland shooting in Florida, an interview with Andrew Pollack, the dad of one of the murdered kids, and an overview of what has not been done and what should be done to protect our kids in their schools. Next on The Dr. Duke Show. Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Duke, and this is The Dr. Duke Show. Every week we cover those stories impacting K-12 classrooms and college campuses across the country. Greetings to all of our listeners, and if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to our podcast on iTunes and never miss a beat, never miss a show. As always, I am joined by the Katie Petrick as my co-pilot on the show, and we kick things off with our first story, which is, this is the one-year anniversary, February 14th, of the terrible, horrific mass shooting at Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. We want to bring this episode around to the idea of school security. One of the big problems we have here at the Dr. Duke Show is it's been a year since this horrific tragedy, and really very little to nothing has been done. In terms of infrastructure, in terms of getting armed police officers or training teachers to actually combat this issue. Over the next 45 minutes, we're going to consider all of these stories. But the shooting occurred February 14th in 2018. 17 students and staff were brutally murdered by a student whose name we will not mention, we will not glorify him that way, who had all sorts of mental health issues.
And immediately there was, controversy with, well, what happened with the sheriff's office, the Broward County Sheriff's Office. What did they do or not do to protect these children and the staff? And Scott Israel has faced harsh criticism in how he handled this shooting. Now, he is the sheriff, and he came out initially saying he did such a great job, and basically found out that officers did not go into the building to save the kids. And he's kept his job up until very recently, when the new governor, Ron DeSantis, suspended him. Basically, his first act on the job after being sworn in as governor, he said, Israel's got to be suspended. And he's accusing the law enforcement chief of neglect of duty and incompetence. And now Israel's appealing this, and he says he still seeks re-election next year.
This is the same guy who basically conceded that his orders, the instructions of the Broward County police officers, was not to go into the building, to allow they knew the shooting was going on, basically told his officers to stand down. Really shocking. And the other big takeaway from the massacre a year ago, to my mind, and I think perhaps has outlasted the actual murders itself. We don't talk about the murders anymore. Many of the kids, the kids who have deceased have faded from our memories. We don't talk much about it. But you know what we still have? A small crop of radical student activists who are making a living and a career on the backs of these dead kids. And David Hogg, of course, is the most visible and the most venal of them. We're going to talk all about this as we move forward today.
Yeah, and what's interesting, if you look at it, a year ago, how these kids came out of nothing. I mean, they were high school students, and several of them have taken kind of different paths, all being activists in their own right. And obviously, David Hogg is one of the most vocal, especially on Twitter, and he uses a lot of curse words, and he got so involved with it, he became basically the front man for the radical activists. But on the other side, we had Kyle Kashev, who was a junior at the time, and he's a senior now, and his direction was he was pro-Second Amendment. So he became vocal, but for the kind of the pro-gun movement, in terms of he started working for Turning Point USA, and he's going on to do these other things. So you have Kyle Kashev on one hand, you have David Hogg and his cronies on the other. And then somewhere in the middle now is actually Cameron Kasky. And he's the one who initially was very vocal, and he started the March for Our Lives, but has since, in this past year, he's seen what has happened, and he's actually walked away from the March for Our Lives movement. And now he's saying, hey, we need to have actual conversations, both sides of the aisle. Why can't we just talk and get somewhere?
Yeah, it is undeniably true, though, that David Hogg, because of the media supporting his position, absolutely no guns, but take every gun away from every American, and the deceptive, dishonest, and downright lies that Hogg has said, the way that David Hogg and his media enablers immediately made the story not about this killer, not about mental health, not about the failures of the police or the failure of the school's own mental health evaluations. It made it about the NRA, right? That's the trouble with this. And the best way I can define David Hogg and his shtick, and he's been well rewarded for it, right? We talked about in a show earlier how despite having middling grades and being turned down by most of the second-tier colleges he applied to, suddenly Harvard has extended. Right, yeah. Exactly. I consider David Hogg exactly what you get if you have a social justice mindset in the schools instead of an educational one. Think of David Hogg as a younger Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez without the bad pantsuit.
Yep, that is an accurate description. But Mike Hogg, as we started calling him, has not gone away, and especially now that it's the one-year anniversary, this week he's been making the rounds, and he was on MSNBC, and he made a bold claim this week saying that AR-15s, which are the most popular rifles, he's saying, if you're using a weapon with an effective range of over 1,500 meters, you are not defending yourself. You are hunting a human being. And he said this live on air, and Andrew Mitchell, who was interviewing him, did not question his comment at all.
If you have an attacker trying to get into your house and he's more than 15 feet away, you're upstairs and he's downstairs, and you pull out your rifle to defend him, right? To defend yourself, you are guilty of hunting the intruder.
Yes.
That's right. Yeah. So it's obvious that Mr. Hogg does not believe in stand your ground laws. It's obvious that Mr. Hogg is sanctioning any kind of violence against you short of murder at a certain range, right? And his point would be, I'm sure, that if the intruder got closer to you than that perimeter, then you would be able to use your handgun. But then I'm pretty sure that once Mr. Hogg succeeds in getting rid of those rifles, he's going to come after your handguns too.
Absolutely. All right, well, let's actually take a look at an interview that Dr. Duke did earlier today with Andrew Pollack, who is a school safety activist and the father of Meadow, who perished in that murder 1 year ago today.
Our guest today has been doing incredible work on behalf of his daughter, Meadow Pollack, who was tragically killed in the Stoneman Douglas High School shooting in Florida, along with 16 others 1 year ago today. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Well, we're here to talk about school security, and the very first question I want to ask you, I know you went and saw Donald Trump recently. I'm going to ask you in a moment how that went, but maybe right off the top, why is it so difficult to enact even common sense security protocols in our public schools? What is going on?
Well, it depends who you ask the question to. If you ask me the question, I'd say we need to approach school safety in a nonpartisan issue. And that's with, let's harden the schools. Let's get the right security there. Let's look into mental health. Let's look into single point of entries. Let's look into protocols that make the school safe. So if you take that approach to it and nonpartisan, we could actually get a lot of things done. It's only when liberals want to push their gun agenda debate into it that we have a problem. And then it deflects, or I call it obstructs. It'll obstruct from keeping our kids and teachers safe in schools when you bring a gun debate into school safety.
I'm stunned reading news from across the country. How many school boards are voting to unarm those police officers? It doesn't make any sense.
It's sick when I read some of those things. That parents, it just shows you that, like, look what happened to me. I didn't take an interest in where my daughter went to school. I thought we lived in a safe community. The crime was low, and I was sending her to a school where she was safe. But now, after looking into all the failed entities and how many people failed my daughter and what type of policies that were in place that led up to February 14th, I made the ultimate mistake by letting my daughter in that public school with people that were like-minded like that, or they believe in not holding kids accountable for committing crimes in schools.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I mean, I look around the country, I see a judge actually ruling that local police are not obligated to risk their lives for our kids. What you said, I think, is powerful. The first thing we have to recognize is that there is no real concerted effort on the part of public schools to protect our kids. If we don't protect them, the schools really aren't.
Well, you got to look into it. The one thing the president did was he rescinded within the last 2 months those Obama-era leniency policies. And a lot of people, I could explain it to you real quick. So Obama put these leniency policies into place that said, we want to put an end to the school-to-prison pipeline. Let's stop arresting at-risk youth. and just put them in like in-house suspension and put them in these programs and coddle them. So what happened was the superintendent, who is from Chicago, has ties to Chicago, came to Broward, and he implemented those policies of not arresting kids for committing crimes. So I bring that up because the gun laws were in place in Florida. If this kid, the murderer, I call him, that murdered my daughter, he could have been arrested numerous times, and he wouldn't have been able to buy a rifle. So the gun laws were in place. He trespassed at the school, wasn't arrested. He threatened to shoot the school up. He wasn't arrested. He threatened people's lives. He punched his mother's teeth out. You know, so many crimes that this kid committed. They let him go to school with swastikas on his arms and the N-word on his backpack. And I feel horrible. I subjected my daughter to go to school in those type of conditions. So the gun laws were in place. That you just have to enforce the laws so kids actually get arrested and have backgrounds. So liberals don't want to ever say that. They just want to talk about background checks, but they fail to mention their liberal policies don't believe in arresting kids when they commit crimes.
Yeah, and the liberal policy about disparate punishment, right? We see the danger of this in Wisconsin schools, that we're easing up on discipline in schools because it has a disparate impact. Whites and blacks aren't treated the same, and all it's doing is even lowering further discipline and what teachers can and do to prevent these kind of things in their own classrooms. And you also mentioned at the beginning of the segment mental health. It's not just that this murderer, as you rightly call him, this dangerous murderer, was breaking crime after crime. He's also clearly mentally ill in many ways. Progressives keep arguing that they're the party that's compassionate about mental illness, but they didn't want to touch this kid either. They didn't want to do anything to remove this kid for his own safety as well as for the safety of your daughter from the school.
Yeah, he slipped through the cracks from a lot of people, and I got to live with that every day, knowing that. But, mental health is a big issue. A lot of these kids, you see it at an early age. And a lot of kids see it also in the school. They tell the kids, see something, say something. And in this instant where this kid murdered my daughter, a lot of the kids said something and nobody did anything.
You did get to meet with the president, and tell us a little bit about what kind of things you proposed to President Trump, and how receptive was he?
He's an amazing type of guy. I met him like 4 or 5 times already, but what was very important to me, and people don't even know what he did, I was in the Oval Office with him, and I spoke to him about, I thought that he should put a commission together to look into school safety. And he looks over the whole pics, and he goes, I want to do that. And he did it. He put his cabinet secretaries, all the secretaries, they formed this commission, a federal commission on school safety, and they did work on it for about 9 months. And one of the main things that they came up with was those Obama-era leniency policies created an unsafe environment, and there's no disparity between African-American kids and Caucasians, even with those policies in place.
Mm. And so when you sat down and talked to him, that's a great idea. And not just beyond your conversations with the president. Just give us 3 things that you think would be most helpful of all the things that you've waded through in trying to make sure that what happened to your daughter never happens to anybody else's children.
Well, that shooting took place about 4 minutes, and he was in that building over 11 minutes without being stopped. So that day, he could have had a musket, and he could have killed 17 people with a musket in the building. So the main thing is, these people are cowards that go to the schools. They know it's a gun-free zone, and they're just sitting targets, these mentally ill people. So I think we need, like we're doing in Florida now, we're training people to work in the schools. And it's not just a weekend course. Liberals like to think that, we're going to arm a teacher. They're going to go for the weekend and take a class for like 20 hours, and then they'll be armed at the school. In Florida, Sheriff Grady Judd wrote the curriculum for this program. It's 150 hours course, so it's over a month long it takes. And they're held to higher standards than regular deputies on their accuracy. They're trained in gun retention. They're trained in school scenarios. So I think it's enough of a deterrent if we could train people that are in the schools to act right away. After seeing it, I was in Polk County in Florida, and I watched this get implemented, the whole summer long, I watched the academy with people going through it. So I'm not opposed to anyone that could pass the course because it's a 50% washout. I'm happy with a lunch lady. If a lunch lady could go through this course and pass it, that's an insurance. I'd be happy with her knowing that she's in the cafeteria. If something happens, she'd be able to protect my kids. And then even crossing guards, you know, why stop? If they could pass it, if they want to voluntarily go through this course for 150 hours and they could pass it, you know, who's to say they're only going to be at the threat will be inside the school, could be outside the school. So we got to be able to eliminate it right away. And I think by this extensive training will be enough of a deterrent to keep bad kids from harming our children at the schools.
Makes obvious, perfect sense. What kind of blowback have you gotten, whether in Florida or nationally, from progressives about this? I mean, what arguments they possibly come up with to try to challenge you on this?
They go nuts, you know what I mean? I like just saying, yeah, let's arm the crossing guards because they can't take, you know what I mean? So they're actually, what they say is, oh my God, we're going to arm a teacher. First of all, it's voluntary. And what happens if the teacher misses? Right? That's their thinking. So the teacher's going to be in the class, right? And someone could come in, like someone evil's going to come into the school and start shooting our kids, but the teacher might miss and hit another kid. That's, if you could believe it, that's what they say. So you'd rather the murderer or a psychopath come into school and just keep shooting people one after the other than rather have a risk of the teacher shooting and missing the killer. That's their main thing. They're worried, or they worry that a bigger student could take the gun away from a smaller teacher.
It is amazing. We've seen some stories where some school districts have advocated throwing hockey pucks or rocks at these killers when they come in, anything but a gun. So on one level, they recognize that teachers and students need to fight back. On the other hand, they are utterly unwilling to equip them to do so. Before we go today, Andrew, on the one-year anniversary of this tragedy, tell us a little bit about how people who want to reach out to you, where can they reach you, where they can get behind what you're doing?
Sure. What I do is I educate parents on my Facebook page, and that's Andrew Pollack, Parkland Parent. Don't go to my regular page. You got to go to the Parkland Parent. And I post a lot of things that could educate parents throughout the country because they should know. Like, I didn't know what happened where I sent my daughter to school. So I'm going to educate you things to look at in your school board. And also to look at my Twitter, Andrew Pollack FL. I'm constantly posting educational things for parents so they could be educated and not send their kid to a school like where I sent my daughter.
Andrew Pollack, it has been a great pleasure and honor to speak to you today. Sir, thank you very much for your hard work, and God bless you and your family.
Well, it's clear you're talking to a passionate father who, admitted that in the video he failed in keeping his daughter safe and not knowing what happened with the school. And so looking ahead here, we're going to take a look at basically understanding what are our options as Americans. What can we do to keep our school kids safe? And, there are people taking action, trying to educate others. Mr. Pollack is one of them. But around the issue of school safety or gun violence or gun control, mental illness, we just keep talking about it and what's actually happening. And there's many different angles to look at it. So we found several stories, and there are a ton out there that we could have picked, but several stories I think kind of encapsulate everything that's gone on in the past year. And we're going to start with Wisconsin here at home because our newly elected Democratic governor is pushing for firearms to be confiscated. So Governor Tony Evers, he was the superintendent of public instruction, and now he became governor. And he is pushing red flag laws, and that these red flag laws allow for a judge to issue orders resulting in firearm actual confiscation. So Evers' Attorney General Josh Cull said the law will allow law enforcement or family members to go to a judge and ensure that somebody who is a threat to themselves or others is temporarily disarmed.
Tony Evers, you got to understand about this. we've talked about this before on the show. He is a radical leftist. He ran Wisconsin public schools, drove them into the ground. Wisconsin school systems used to be among the best in the country. He took over. One of the first things he did was bring Common Core into the state to politicize education. And it's funny. We've said this many times. I still think Governor Walker would have won re-election if he had taken on Tony Evers. One of the reasons Governor Scott Walker is not governor anymore is because he refused to try to check the overreach of the Department of Public Instruction in this state. Many of us activists have begged him to get involved, to do more than just condemn things like Common Core and these big educational programs that were ideologically turning out more David Hogg type kids, because they were all social justice and they were short on actual achievement. It's one thing for me, you're my sister, and I think that you're unstable and you've got a gun. I go to the police and say, hey, I'm worried about it. They come and confiscate your rifle or your gun. I think that is a no-go anyway. We shouldn't be doing that. But let's assume it's true. That means if the police also have that kind of authority, will the police be able to, based on a Facebook post? If there's a picture of you with your assault rifle or a so-called assault rifle, you with a couple of handguns, is that enough in a social media for the police to determine that you must be temporarily, and what does temporarily mean, right? Temporarily disarmed. It's a very slippery slope. You got to be very careful about people reporting on people. You got to be even more skeptical about law enforcement agencies taking it into their own hands to decide on the basis of what, whether you are worthy of possessing a gun or not.
Yeah, and Wisconsin is wanting to do this, but the California Democrats, which is to say California, already passed a red flag law back in 2014, and shockingly, it's incrementally expanded itself in the past years since. And in 2018, the law was amended to make it easier to get a confiscation order. And then January 1 this year, it was now broadened again to allow for confiscation of ammunition and firearm accessories. So little by little, they're just doing it. And if we say, we're doing this for the children, they're coming for your guns. I mean, I don't know how else to say it, but they're coming for your guns.
And this is one of the perhaps most discussed issues in American life today. And it's bigger than education, it's bigger than guns. But it's this idea that somehow, once a law is passed, that the law keeps morphing. We keep it, without any debate, without any further vote, these laws keep expanding. I mean, Title IX is a classic example. We've talked about this many times about education. How Title IX, which simply was designed to allow women equal access to compete in sports on college campuses, has now become everything from an attack on due process to a challenge to the First Amendment about what you are and are not allowed to say. It's staggering how laws that even made some common sense when they were passed aren't repealed and replaced with other ones, but they grow. And the danger of these gun laws, like you said, is when California passes those laws, then suddenly they're just adding amendments and they're adding codicils and extra texts that allow them to completely expand the scope of what they do. And it never comes back to the people for consideration.
Well, and they don't even have to pass new laws to amend anything. It's just, how do the bureaucrats interpret it? And then how do the courts also interpret it? Because that's what happens on a local, state, federal level. And we're going to see it. It's coming down the pipeline in every issue, all of our rights moving forward. It's not just this one.
In a fundraising email, Evers said, quote, "Instead of acting to reduce gun violence, Republicans want to give guns to teachers. Got news for you, Tony. Armed teachers and armed resource officers would have shot dead the Stoneman killer way before he had a chance to murder anybody else." And your response, Tony Evers, shockingly, is that Republicans want to give teachers and to put resource officers and police officers in the schools, armed resource officers, to make sure no child dies like Andrew Pollack had to die. No father has to go through the rest of his life wondering why he didn't pull his kids from those public schools and find a safer environment. And you're blaming the Republicans for this. You want all this money for all of these resource officers, but absolutely no guns, and you want to confiscate the guns that people have. You make no sense. This makes no sense. At least be honest about this. What you want is to use these dead kids as the linchpin that gets you to ban guns from everybody.
Yeah, well, you didn't even finish that quote because I think you left out some of the best parts. He says, as a lifelong educator, number one, he is not a lifelong educator, but I digress. I can say without any hesitation that I'd rather go to jail than arm teachers in our schools. And he later said, more guns will increase the danger for our kids, not reduce it.
Go to jail than arm teachers. Allow adult Americans with Second Amendment constitutional protections to defend themselves and the kids they care about from attackers. You'd rather go to jail. You know what you are, Tony Evers, by this? You are somebody who is putting kids in harm's way. In a sense, you are a child abuser. And you know what happens to child abusers in prison, Tony. I would be careful about asking to go to jail rather than allow teachers to defend themselves and their kids. Because people like you, Bubba would love to see you coming, Tony.
All right. Well, we have, not that instance, but we have something similar going on in Baltimore, where the school board recently unanimously voted against allowing police officers to carry firearms in school. It was 2 weeks ago, the Baltimore City Public Schools Board of School Commissioners voted 10-0, opposing House Bill 31, and it would have allowed the school resource officers to carry guns in buildings. So instead, when they come in to, be on duty that day, they're going to lock up their guns at the beginning of their shift and then walk around the school with their hands in the air. I'm not even sure. But at this meeting, there were a bunch of students who opposed the bill, and they took over the meeting, and they were chanting and protesting about it.
Yeah, and this is all bound up with the question of progressive racial attitudes, right? Social justice warriors and race. The argument is that cops kill black kids. That's the argument. Although we don't have a single example that I can think of, a cop in a school shooting any school kid, let alone any African-American school kid. In fact, cops in schools have prevented shootings or minimized them, right? And we know they deter, right? The idea that they're going to be armed police in a school is a deterrent. It's the schools that have the absolutely no gun policies that the ones that tend to get shot up the most. Having said that, in Baltimore, where you have a huge number of murders every year, and black-on-black violence and murders are high in the city of Baltimore, we're actually teaching our kids to believe that armed police officers are a bigger threat to the kids than they are actually to the murderers. And with this kind of an educational system, I mean, you can't win. No matter what happens, the cops are going to be blamed. No matter what happens, our culture will be blamed because on the one hand, you say no guns, no way to protect our kids. We won't arm teachers. We won't do any of that stuff. On the other hand, you are just sitting around waiting for the next tragedy to go further and further and trying to strip Americans away of their constitutionally protected rights to own arms. And if you look at the quote from Kimberly Humphrey, right, a tool of the American Civil Liberties Union.
Very important that students are in an environment where they feel safe, welcomed, and comfortable. And having a gun around is not comfortable for learning.
Can I just say, this is Baltimore. We've had how many stories on this show showing physical violence being done by the students to teachers and to fellow students, and nothing's being done. This is Baltimore. They're already disrupted in their learning environment and already not comfortable.
Students punching teachers, students waylaying each other in the hallway, students rioting across the campuses. It is staggering when you think about this. And heaven forbid there are armed security guards to put this down. This is a clear-cut case of what we're trying to say here on this show, Katie, that what these policies are doing is actually preparing us for the next murder, the next slaughter. And then it's almost ghoulish, right? That all of these policies, you know what's even more uncomfortable for learning? What actually does disrupt learning in a classroom? When there is somebody in the school with a gun that's not a cop. That not only disrupts learning, it disrupts life. Got it?
All right. Well, we have a judge who says that, cops and schools have no legal duty to protect kids from school shootings. And this is specifically at Parkland because the reason is that they weren't in custody. All right, so in December, U.S. District Judge Beth Bloom dismissed a lawsuit filed by 15 unnamed students of Parkland who say they suffered psychological trauma from the shooting. The lawsuit claimed the school district and the Broward County Sheriff's Office, oh, good old Broward County, along with former school resource officer Scott Peterson, he's the one who didn't go into the building, school campus monitor Andrew Medina, and former BSO captain Jan Jordan failed through action or inaction to protect the students while at school. Now, Bloom says that the claim arises from the actions of the shooter, a third party, and not a state actor. Thus, the critical question the court analyzes is whether defendants had a constitutional duty to protect plaintiffs from the actions of the shooter. As previously stated, for such a duty to exist on the part of defendants, plaintiffs would have to be considered to be in custody. So basically, she said, for example, as prisoners or patients of a mental hospital, this is the only way there would be legal protection. It makes absolutely no sense.
What blows me away is the hypocrisy of this. You see what you're being told, right? The judge said basically the shooting was the fault of the third party. Every other liberal activist from the ACLU to David Hogg blames it on the NRA, blames it on the Second Amendment, blames it on all sorts of things but the shooter. So it blows me away. The argument here on the judge's part is that this is all the shooter's fault. The police, the school has no responsibility to protect your kids. And you see how that feeds into what we saw from that ACLU tool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, they're going to look to appeal, and we'll see what happens. So, okay, then here's the question. If we're not going to arm our police officers who are in the school, what can we do? What can our kids do? What can our teachers do if they're not able to be armed? And we've, in the past year, gotten some absolutely ridiculous options. And I'm going to start with the bucket of rocks.
Let me before you hit the bucket of rocks, just reemphasize one thing. We're not going to arm the teachers.
Yep.
We're not going to allow armed police officers in our schools. There will be no offensive guns in our schools because they make learning uncomfortable,
yes.
right? So these are the things that the left has already decided. Okay, but go ahead.
Okay, so now we have a bucket of rocks. Blue Mountain School District in Orwigsburg, Pennsylvania, equipped all 200 of their classrooms with a bucket of actual rocks. Stones, whatever you want to call them. And then teachers are supposed to use these as a last line of defense. The superintendent, David Helsel, said, "We didn't want our students to be helpless victims. River stones were my idea. I thought they would be more effective than throwing books or book bags or staplers."
River stones. Can't you just see the school getting out for an afternoon to go collect river rocks to protect themselves? And I love the idea that this is the last line of defense. In other words, before you are shot dead, the last thing we're going to allow you to do is pick up a couple rocks and throw them at your... the guns are the problem. The cops are a problem. The cops with guns are a problem. Arming teachers is the problem. But everybody gets a river rock. I wonder if it's one of those nice, smooth river rocks they use for sensual massages and spas, right? Put them down people's spines.
That would make people comfortable for their learning.
Comfortable. Ah, I see. Protecting people's lives in schools is all about comfort, right?
Exactly.
We won't do anything to make anybody uncomfortable. And if protecting your life as a little fifth grader makes ACLU people on the outside comfortable, we're not going to do it. If David Hogg at Harvard is bothered by the gun that's going to save your life the next time your school is invaded, his discomfort from 1,000 miles away trumps your right to live.
It does. Well, at a university, since you're speaking of Harvard, we have Oakland University in Michigan, and their big wise idea, I guess, is to arm the students with hockey pucks. Basically, the university police chief, Mark Gordon, was asked, what items could we use? What could we do? And he said, as a spur-of-the-moment idea that seemed to have some merit to it, hockey pucks caught on. Now, the faculty union purchased these 2,500 hockey pucks at 94 cents each.
$2,500 for hockey pucks. Where is
Don? 2,500 hockey pucks. Well, yeah, I guess it is. Right. Plus tax, I guess.
With math, probably more than that, of taxpayer money to buy hockey. Where's Don Rickles when you need him? The real hockey pucks here are the idiots who proposed this. And by the way, if you're going to give them hockey pucks, everybody knows that you cannot throw a hockey puck as fast and as violently as you can use to hit it with a hockey stick. So let's invest in hockey sticks to project the hockey pucks at the proper speed to disarm a killer. And then, of course, you're going to have to invest in Zamboni machines to completely pave every aspect of the school floor with ice so that you can rock it with your hockey stick, hockey pucks, in the direction. And if you're going to do that, you're going to have to get goalie masks for all of the teachers in case there's any ricochets of hockey pucks off people's heads. This is the dumbest thing I've heard since the last story, and probably not as dumb as the next story we're going to talk about.
Well, we're going to be back in Parkland because immediately after the shooting, by April then, so with a month and a half or so, they had issued clear backpacks. 3,200 clear, see-through backpacks were donated to the school, and Principal Ty Thompson said the enhanced security measures would be very similar to when you enter a sporting event, concert, or even Disney World. So these backpacks were supposed to be secure, and then they kind of beefed up their idea of security.
So basically, you're making kids walk into school with backpacks that are transparent, as if any killer ever who's used a rifle has had it in a backpack. It is the dumbest argument, again, I've ever heard. And so now that you've got transparent backpacks, the idea is that means no one's going to find any other... Look, it is not the kids who you are doing this to are the kids you have to be aware of. And you know that. And so all you're doing is, again, you're not just compromising the health and safety of these kids, you are compromising their privacy rights. I mean, you are literally forcing these kids. You're traumatizing them and victimizing them in entirely other ways now for things that they're not responsible for and things that aren't going to stop guns. You are adamant about stopping guns every way but the only ways that we know matter.
Yeah, and they realized this, so they already scrapped those backpacks for this past fall. But when kids did return to school in the fall, they had metal detectors, a buzzer system for the front office, IDs and lanyards, additional resource officers, other security personnel, 52 new cameras, more fencing. Fencing.
Build a wall.
Okay, and new locks on the doors and new fire alarm.
Well, and this is the other thing, Katie. You notice that they say this is this is going to be just like what happens at arenas and stadiums and Disney World. Guess where there have never really been shootings? At Disney World or arenas and stadiums. And it has nothing to do with clear backpacks. It has everything to do with armed security patrolling every corner and every quadrant of those venues. It is about not just having clear and transparent backpacks, but it's actually having metal detectors. The very things that they've started to implement. But all of it comes down to human resources, right? You can have all the metal detectors, you can have all that stuff in the world, cameras. What you need is, again, that armed security presence that the progressive left just doesn't want to see as part of this. Because it would have to force... And here's the reason. They are sacrificing kids' safety because to recognize the fact that armed teachers, responsibly armed teachers, or more armed policemen in the schools would be a tacit acknowledgement that the best way to fight gun crimes is with responsible gun owners, and that their politics and vanity and their contempt for the Second Amendment and American rights is not enough to make them cede this point and do the right thing. Their politics here are utterly overwhelming their ability to protect our school kids. And Mr. Pollack is right. Mom and Dad, if you got your kids in these schools, you got your kids in Tony Evers, Wisconsin schools, and he would rather go to jail than allow teachers to defend your kids with actual weapons responsibly wielded. If that's where you live now, why send your kids? When your kids are murdered, if it happens, God forbid, but if it happens, your kids are murdered here, Tony Evers is going to have no sympathy for you. Some circuit judge is going to argue that Wisconsin police officers were not obligated to go into the school and defend you, right? Tony Evers doesn't care about your kids' welfare. He cares about his politics.
He does. One more item, and it's the best of the options that we've discussed so far, but just this month, Kevlar Backpacks went on sale, and it's from an Israeli company called Armor Me. The packs are designed with safety in mind and for the most common attack scenarios. The Kevlar used exceeds the global standard for safety for handgun attacks. Now, there are two different kinds of backpacks. There's a single panel backpack, so just a standard looking one you put on your back, and that's going to cost $160 to $190, and that covers you from your neck to your waist, and you can either put it on your front or put it on your back. But there's a double paneled backpack, which is about $210, $250, and that one actually is going to cover both your front and your back, and when you unzip it, it flips down, and it covers you all the way from your knees up to your neck. And it basically, I mean, if you imagine a kindergartner, a little 5-year-old with a Kevlar backpack and, his little crayons and his paintbrushes in the back of his backpack, I don't know how a 5-year-old's going to walk through a school, but in terms of the upper elementary and in high school and that, it might
this is a great idea.
Safe,
this is a great idea. And leave it to the Israelis, right? I mean, exactly. Heaven forbid Tony Evers in his macho, I'd rather go to jail bullshit. Well, rather than that, Tony Evers, why not consult with the people whose kids are being blown up for about 100 years now, right? Why not look at how the Israelis do. The same thing about airport. TSA doesn't need to be as complicated as it is. Look at how the Israelis protect their planes. Go to the people who have been under the gun literally for 70 years and watch how they do things. They manage to do it by protecting people's civil rights, their human rights, their rights to privacy, and they do it very effectively. Absolutely. And they do it by having a no messing around. We're going to stop you by any means necessary before you even get in our kids' schools. And once you're in, we're going to shoot you dead with the personnel we already have. That's the way to do it. But it's surprising. The same liberals the same ACLU clown show, the same Tony Evers type progressive educrats who absolutely adamantly will go to jail before we see our kids protected with guns are the same cowards, right, who have the rising anti-Semitism on the left, right? These congresswomen elected, these progressive educrats with their divest from Israel BS. It's not a surprise. I think there's a causal link here between the way Israel defends itself from outside attacks and the rise of anti-Semitism when it comes to this, these new politicians in the progressive left generally, and how they all fit together here. Israel protects itself. Israel is safe and no nonsense in defending its people, all of its people, from attacks, even if that means going on the offensive to do so. That's part of the problem, and that's why the left doesn't like them. And you can sort of see a parallel here between the school situation in terms of how we protect our kids and the new rise of this anti-Semitism on the left. I think there is a coherent connection that can be made.
Well, for the final story of the week, we're back in Florida, where it all started. So we actually have a school that hired combat veterans with semi-automatic rifles to protect students from active shooters. The New York Times reported that the Manatee School for the Arts in Palmetto, Florida, hired 2 combat veterans who, by the end of this month, end of February, will be seen in body armor roaming the grounds, each carrying a 9mm Glock handgun and a semi-automatic rifle with a 17-inch barrel. So you can imagine what this is. Principal Bill Jones said that if an armed intruder were to enter the campus, we're not looking for a fair fight. We're looking at an overwhelming advantage.
We heard from all those other halfwits before that guns in public schools make the kids uncomfortable. You know what would make me so chill and comfortable? To know that I have got guys in military-grade armor with major weapons ready to blow the head off of any douchebag that shows up in my school with a gun. That would be wonderful. That's total comfort.
I can learn now. I can learn.
I think I need a cigarette.
Oh my. All right. Well, because in case anyone's like, well, that shouldn't be allowed. Are these people even trained? Don't worry, they are. The Manatee County Sheriff's Department trained the guards. The man who's
they're combat vets.
I know.
I don't give a crap what some school administrator trains them. They were trained by the Marines.
Okay, so here we go. One, the guy who was hired first and has been on campus now for a few months, he has 15 years of infantry experience, and the other guy is finishing his training. He's going to be on campus just by the end of the month, and they have had to complete at least 132 hours of firearm safety and proficiency training. And basically, this goes to the broader issue in Florida overall. Now, after Parkland, the Florida legislature required that schools have at least one safe school officer. And through the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School Public Safety Act, they gave schools options of what a safe school officer is. Now, you could choose between a school resource officer who is employed by a law enforcement agency. You could have a school safety officer who's employed by either a law enforcement agency or by the school district board, or you could have a school guardian, which is a school employee trained to stop lethal attacks. And only 9 of the 67 countywide school districts chose these full-time guardians, and that's what this school did, is they have guardians. And it's kind of interesting to see which option these schools are going to take.
Here's what's going to happen. The schools with the armed dude, can I read that again? That these active Manatee schools, combat veterans, right? That they are armed with 9mm Glock handguns and semi-automatic rifles with a 17-inch barrels. I don't think the Bismarck battleship had those kinds of guns on it. I'm telling you what's going to happen. That the schools that are going to be preyed upon are going to be, and the ones where the massacres will be the most successful, will be the ones without the combat veterans, right? And so the first time this happens, right, every single mother in that state is going to scream bloody murder that my school did not have those combat heroes on board. And this is the absolute despicableness of the left. They're going to wait until it happens. Yeah. They won't do anything until more kids are murdered. Then when more kids are murdered, they're going to ignore the fact that this could have been stopped by schools like this, especially when the lawsuit comes, and again blame the NRA. So again, go back to what Andrew Pollack so eloquently said. Because he just wasn't aware of it, because it didn't stop to think about it. He's going to live with the rest of his life He's going to live with the ideal that his daughter's dead because he did not pay enough attention to the lax security in the schools and the school's venal unwillingness to do what it takes to protect those kids. And nothing's going to protect them better, and nothing's going to make kids more comfortable than knowing that they've got those kinds of men in those kinds of armor, willing to do those kinds of things with those kinds of weapons to protect them at any cost. Men who will not stand outside the school with guns and refuse to go in under Israel's shoddy Broward County leadership. These are trained combat veterans who are there for one purpose, to fight and die on behalf of those kids should it become necessary. It's as simple as that. You can parse this any way you want, progressive left. It's as simple as that, and you're on the wrong side of this debate.
And now we're going to wrap things up with extra credit, where we read stories so you don't have to. We begin with an American university student who could not finish her meal at the Washington, D.C. dining hall because she was so disgusted that there was a man daring to wear a Confederate flag sweatshirt in her presence. Sociology major Frances Hernandez was triggered at the violence of the Confederate sweatshirt and was appalled at how the police officer she complained to then spoke cordially with the man in the sweatshirt. I mean, what is a cop supposed to do? Start a civil war?
Little progressive idiots who don't like guns and cops. When the first time they see a sign or a sweatshirt they don't like, they want people pistol whipped and shot. Get over it, snowflake.
Meanwhile, across town, students at George Washington University continue efforts to get the mascot renamed from colonials because, you know, inclusivity and racism and every other ism. Student Senator Haley Margulis, who leads the charge in pitiful petition, said, "School spirit is something that should be based on equality." In the words of the country's forefather and first president, George Washington, you dumb.
He also a colonial. Right? I mean, the picture was of George Washington, who was a colonial, meaning he lived in the colonial era. Again, snowflake, get over it.
Another president named George is in trouble. A George H.W. Bush statue was unveiled at Hampton University, a historically black university in Virginia. It's one of 11 statues honoring men and women of varying ethnicities from all walks of life in Legacy Park. But protesters are showing ire toward Bush's statue, saying he did some hurtful things to black people. But Barack Obama's statue's there, so...
Yeah, I don't know what they're complaining about. It's a bronze statue, which makes him look like he's got black or brown skin, so get over it.
2 Utah high school seniors were disqualified during a debate on immigration after they dared provide quotes from Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson. The boys were assigned to argue against the federal government reducing restrictions on legal immigration. The affirmative side read a slam poem as a response and said the negative side couldn't talk about fairness because they were white males. The white males then read Shapiro and Peterson quotes about identity politics, and the judge said the boys were being racist. Needless to say, the boys lost the round and America lost hope.
So according to social justice debating policy, a slam poem is evidence, and citing one of the foremost brilliant minds in the country today, Ben Shapiro, is a sort of form of racism. Debating as a science is now officially dead.
And finally, it was buttocks and bullocks, as economics scholar Victoria Bateman's naked body was the centerpiece of a lecture. Cambridge economists decided to once again, she's done this before, but once again, she got naked in front of people as a form of protest. This time she gave a lecture in the nude with "Brexit leaves Britain naked" scrawled on herself. She encouraged people to sign her body to create a living anti-Brexit petition. Those poor, poor writing utensils.
Yeah, buttocks and bollocks. Bollocks, of course, is an English euphemism for testicles, and I'm pretty sure there's a pair hiding behind that black strip.
With that, make sure you head over to iTunes or your favorite platform and subscribe to the podcast. Leave us that coveted 5-star review if you would. And make sure you head over to Freedom Project, one word, on Facebook to get all the articles and new videos we're doing every week.
And that does it for us this week on The Dr. Duke Show. You like what you heard, please share the podcast with your friends. For Freedom Project, I'm Dr. Duke, she's Katie, and we'll see you next time, bollocks indeed.